I was in a pet store actually in about '96, and there was a white snake. I was a king snake or something, and there were a couple of college dudes in there, and one of them said, "Oh, a white snake," and this is essentially pre-internet, and I just heard the comment, and I said, "You wouldn't perchance know when Whitesnake's next album is coming out, would you?" And one of them said, "Well, hopefully never."
Oh,
Oh, okay, so you're a dick. All right, thanks. Hey, everybody, just me again, Wayne. And what I've got for you today is the first of a three-part interview that I've done with Christopher Hilton. Christopher is the author of the book, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. You can get Christopher's book through Amazon, either for your Kindle or in print form. Now, I know what you're going to say. If you're at all into metal, you don't like the term hair metal. Neither do I. Neither does Christopher, actually. And we talk about that during one of the three parts of the interview. But if you use the term hair metal, then anyone who is at all into metal knows exactly what you're talking about. They know the era and they know the type of music to which you are referring. So, hence the use of the term hair metal in the title. So, here we go. First of three parts of this interview with Christopher Hilton. I hope you like it. It's nice to meet you. Right.
you too. Always a pleasure to meet other fans of the genre and to speak with them and get their opinions and thoughts on the music.
It's nice, and it's more common now than it was for a long time. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure you recall in the '90s when admitting that you liked, '80s metal was sort of a badge of shame.
Oh, those were dark, dark days. Yes, I didn't have a whole lot of friends in the mid 90s, but yeah, it's a little more in vogue, a little more acceptable to the average commoner. So happy to know that.
Yeah, I was in a pet store actually in about '96, and there was a white snake. I was a king snake or something, and there were a couple of college dudes in there, and one of them said, "Oh, a white snake," and this is essentially pre-internet, and I just heard the comment, and I said, "You wouldn't perchance know when Whitesnake's next album is coming out, would you?" And one of them said, "Well, hopefully never."
Oh,
Oh, okay, so you're a dick. All right, thanks. Nice response to a stranger there.
actually,
But
that you said that was 1996.
yeah, '96, maybe '97.
Ironically, their next album came out in 97, but it was so unpopular it didn't even get a release in the United States. The Restless
Oh,
Heart album was only released overseas. So that's
yeah,
how bad it was.
re- yeah. I was going to say Restless Hearts. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, Restless Heart. It was the genre was so unpopular. A band that sold millions and millions of records just a few years earlier couldn't even get their record released in America in 1997.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Now, was that the last album that Adrian Vandenberg played on for a while? Because I know he and David Coverdale kind of had
Yeah,
a
he's
riff.
been guesting on and off. I mean, they did an amazing acoustic album, Starkers in Tokyo. I don't know if you ever heard that. If you haven't had a chance and you're a fan, track it down. Just an amazing performance. But yeah, I mean, hopefully one day we'll get to hear something with the two of them fully engaged again, but hasn't happened quite yet.
So, well, hopefully soon. I feel like I saw a headline on, YouTube or something here recently, saying Adrian Vandenberg reaches out to David Coverdale or vice versa, that kind of thing. Most concerts that I go to are concerts by bands whose newer material hasn't sold very well or who don't have any newer material. Like 2 or 3 years ago, I saw Cheap Trick and Joan Jett and Heart on a triple, bill in Kansas City. And man, Kansas City loves the Wilson sisters, by the way. I had no
Yeah.
idea. So, but Cheap Trick had put out an album not very long before that, and they try. And I know none of these are really like hair metal bands, but it just sort of leading up to the question. And Cheap Trick tried really hard to fit new material into their set, and it just didn't work. People went to the bathroom or went to get another beer or something like that. And I'd seen Cheap Trick 3 times prior, and I'd never heard anything negative come out of Rick Nielsen's mouth. But he was blatantly pissed off, and he just, not to overstate the case, but he bitched ad nauseum for the rest of their set. And then Joan Jett and Hart just, stuck to the back catalogs, and everything went fine, right? So suggesting that most people who went there were there, for nostalgia, or, because they want the music they grew up with. So, and I'm sure that there's some of that in the rebirth of hair metal. Um, but I guess I want to ask your opinion. And I know you talk about this in your book, but what are other factors that you think maybe are playing into this sort of re-rise of this type of music? I mean, it can't all be nostalgia.
Well, I think, the rebirth actually goes back quite a ways. And a lot of people have commented on the book casually and said, the rise of hair metal, I get that. The fall, I definitely understand that. And they kind of scratch their heads at the rebirth. They say, I really didn't pick up on that, because basically, hair metal is certainly not as popular or will ever be as popular in all likelihood as it was in the late 80s. But it had fallen so far in the 90s, right? To the
Okay.
point where it was basically extinct. I mean, at least commercially. I mean, there were plenty of bands putting out music, not as many as they were, but for people who knew where to find it, bands were still making music contrary to popular belief. But it had fallen so far in the 90s that it had nowhere to go but potentially back up if it resurfaced at all. By 2000, by the turn of the century, there was a legitimate resurrection of sorts, because most of these bands were down for the count. Again, at least commercially, grunge was basically gone at that point. I mean, you had new metal and you had rap rock in 1999, and those styles weren't exactly in the immediate hair metal family, but they were undoubtedly much closer relatives than the black sheep that was grunge. The music had more of a renewed sense of energy and passion. And part of what made the 80s wasn't just the music, it was the whole climate. And by the time we got to the year 2000, the economy started to flourish again. We had the dot-com bubble. And yeah, people started to pick up a sense of nostalgia. People that had grown up on this music, they were adults now and they had jobs and they had families, but they could make it out to the fairgrounds on a Friday or Saturday night, with plenty of nostalgia to have a few drinks and relive their youth and see a package bill. And, they were ready to have nothing but a good time again and hear the songs and live a little of their glory days. And touring was really where this reunion was felt. Bands discovered that they could do these, when I said package tours, and draw a bigger bill and still play to 15, 20,000 people. You had the Rocks Never Stops tour. Poison would go out with Cinderella and Rat and Warrant and Quiet Riot. There were other signs of the resurgence as well. I mean, commercially, MTV, had written off the genre, but then you remember right around 2000, VH1 did the Behind the Musics. And Def Leppard was one of the best ones they had in terms of a reception. There were all kinds of greatest hits and re-recordings. KNAC came back in LA as a radio station, and the band started to put out more music in addition to getting back on the road, and they got back to some of that style. Def Leppard had put out the very, alternative sounding Slang album in the mid 90s, but when they did Euphoria, right around 1999, that sounded more like Adrenalize. Or a band like Motley Crue, who did the super hard and heavy self-titled album in 1994, or the grunge album Generation Swine in 97, they did New Tattoo. And while that wasn't a return to the glory days, in my view, at least it was guitar-based driven, sleazy party rock. And of course, Bon Jovi was there, right? I mean, kind of the band that broke it all open in 1986, at least commercially. They put out the Crush album, and It's My Life was the third biggest single in the world that year. And there was all the reunions, right? Skid Row got back together, not necessarily with Sebastian Bach. Mr. Big got back together. It was all over the place. So there was this legitimate rebirth. I mean, Poison got back together with CeCe DeVille and had those big 2 tours. But nowadays, to your point, a lot of the bands are living off their touring. And it's disappointing to hardcore fans like myself, to your point, where, you might like to see some new songs in the set. There's nothing I would love more than for some of these bands to break out some older songs that you don't hear, some B-sides, or produce new music. But let's face it, 80 to 90 to maybe 95% of the people that are there for that Saturday night tour that are going to see Poison or Def Leppard, they only want to hear the hits because those were the songs that made up their youth. There's this phrase, if you're a musician, the worst words you could ever utter on stage is, now we're going to play a new song. Because to your point, right, it's an interview to shoot. It's an opportunity to shoot straight for the beer stand or the restroom. So, I've actually, crazy as it sounds, I've stopped going to see Poison in recent years. because it's the same exact set list they've been playing for literally 20 years. And I get it. I mean, if they were to satisfy a fan like me and sneak in something like Back to the Rocking Horse off Open Up a Sour, or heaven forbid something off Hollyweird like Shooting Star, which Hollyweird was a terrible album, by the way, in my opinion. But then what song are they going to leave out? Some 9 out of 10 of their fans are going to say, oh my gosh, they didn't play this song. How could they? And especially on these package tours, the bands don't get 17 songs. They get 10
Right.
or 11.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. There's just not a lot in it for them to make new music. There's no money in making a new album for the most part. And 90% of the people in the audience don't want to hear the new song. So unfortunately, it really stifles creativity. And it's difficult for hardcore fans to really appreciate the same set year after year. But anyway, long answer to your short question.
It's all right. No, it's a good answer. And I'm thinking of Sammy Hagar in the Circle, right? I mean, because I don't think anyone ever really classified Sammy as hair metal, but he with Van Halen and selling gazillions of records, in the day. And he put together Chickenfoot,
Yes.
who put out 2 really good albums, but that didn't sell worth a damn, apparently. So then he formed the Circle and it's their whole thing is it's greatest hits from beginning to end, And I'd love to go see Sammy in the Circle, actually, but yeah, I think it really speaks to your point, that touring rather than album sales, is the main the main cash.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be back in the day, you would tour to support an album. And then it basically became you would put out an album to give people a reason to come see your tour. And then lately, just forget about the new music. There's nothing in it. At least, I'm glad that some of the bands still have some creative juices, but monetarily, there's pretty much nothing there for them. So their money, their bread and butter is going to be on the touring circuit and that's about it.
Right, right. I saw, and neither of these I know is categorized generally as a hair metal band, but I saw both Iron Maiden and Judas Priest on their respective. Well, it wasn't Maiden's most recent tour; it was the one before that, but it was in support of their most recent album. And both those bands played, plenty of material from the new album. And while it didn't get as good a reception as the hits, it still got a good reception. And they both, A Book of Souls, I think sold more than any Maiden album since Brave New World. And Firepower, I think it's widely regarded as one of Priest's just best albums, period. And
I think so, for sure.
Heavy competition there,
But think about it, those 2 bands, I mean, I think they have more leeway to play new music and have it be accepted by their fans because these are bands that built their audience not necessarily on what was on radio and MTV at the time.
Right.
These are hardcore fans that are going to appreciate everything they do. Def Leppard, of course, has very hardcore fans, but it also has a lot of casual fans that were only fans in the 80s. And they don't have as much leeway with the audience to entertain new things. That audience only knows things off Hysteria and Pyromania, whereas the average Judas Priest fan, they know about Firepower and they're loving it just as much as they love Painkiller, perhaps. But that's a distinct difference, is that the bands that built themselves up with a heavy commercial backing versus those that built themselves up based on just the strength of their hardcore fans. Again, not to say that hair metal doesn't have its hardcore fans, because it certainly does. But it's an interesting difference there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, my wife asked me just a little while ago as I was getting ready for this interview. She said that when she was exposed to anything, close to hard rock, with this hair metal or heavy metal or adjective metal, in the 80s, it was generally, and for the young women that she knew, it was generally through their boyfriends, right, when they were on a date or something like that. And so, I wonder how much of the drop off in album sales, of hair metal was caused by young women, not buying the albums anymore because they got a different boyfriend or what have you, Thoughts about that?
I don't know that contributed a whole lot, right? I mean, hair metal, one of the great things, and yeah, I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, but anyone who's read the book knows the very first sentence of the book says, I have a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal Because I do, and we can get into that. But forgiveness from folks, I'm going to use it casually here. But one of the things about the genre, call it '80s hard rock, call it glam metal, call it whatever you want. Back in the day, you called it heavy metal. Yes, believe it or not, right? Poison and Warrant were heavy metal in 1988. But one of the things that offered to the audience was really an accessibility. And when you talk about the female audience, when you thought about heavy metal historically, and you think about bands like Black Sabbath or Deep Purple, hair metal or glam metal or whatever we wanted to call it at the time took a lot of that heavy element and combined it with a more readily available, commercially accessible melody and some things that could open up its audience. And then, of course, on top of that, especially after Motley Crue's Home Sweet Home in 1985, of course, followed by the billions of power ballads after that, that's when you really got the female audience. Yeah, you're right. I mean, most of the time, if you saw females at a hair metal show before 1986, they were 10 to 20% of the audience. If you looked out on Motley Crue Shout at the Devil tour at the crowd in 1984, it was probably 80% male, maybe even more. By the time you got to the late 80s, it was probably half and half, maybe even skew more. Certainly at a Bon Jovi show, there was more females because the power ballad, really brought them into the fold. That was really the trick, is that if you could write a power ballad, then you doubled your audience, especially since the power ballad basically ensured that you had airplay on top 40 radio and, most importantly, MTV, which in a non-internet age was the only vehicle or avenue for exposure for these bands. So it was a big deal to be able to draw in the females.
There we go, the first of my three-part interview with Christopher Hilton, author of The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, okay? Subscribe. Ask your brother to subscribe. Hail strangers on the street. Ask them to subscribe. Doesn't matter who. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions or comments, by all means, put them in the comment section below. All right, thank you very much for watching. Come back for part 2. Talk to you soon.